Ma'am, janitors use the back entrance. The laughter came fast, low and smug, bouncing off the marble walls of Fulton County Courthouse like it belonged there. A few attorneys near the security checkpoint smirked into their coffee cups. Someone muttered, "Damn," under his breath. Sheriff Cole Walker adjusted the silver badge on his chest and leaned one arm against the metal detector like he owned the building itself. The fluorescent lights overhead painted everything in cold white glare, reflecting across polished floors that smelled faintly of bleach and old paper. Naomi Brooks stood still in the center of it all, one hand wrapped around a worn leather folder pressed tightly against her navy coat. She didn't react to the comment. Didn't lower her eyes. Didn't argue. That seemed to irritate him more. Cole looked her up and down again, taking in the practical flats, the modest handbag, the quiet posture that didn't fit the expensive suits flowing through the courthouse lobby. "Court staff entrance is around back," he said louder this time, making sure nearby reporters and deputies could hear. "Unless you got lost on the way to maintenance." Another ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the folder. The movement was almost invisible, but enough to betray the pressure building beneath her calm expression. Outside, rain tapped softly against the courthouse windows, gray clouds hanging low over downtown Atlanta. People hurried through the revolving doors carrying umbrellas and legal briefs, their shoes squeaking across the polished stone. The morning air inside felt too warm, too crowded, heavy with perfume, printer ink, and the stale scent of burnt coffee drifting from a kiosk near the elevators. Naomi finally spoke, her voice low and even. "I'm here for courtroom 4B. Sheriff Walker chuckled immediately. "You and half the city." He stepped slightly in front of her path. "That hearing's invitation only." Naomi glanced toward the brass elevator doors at the far end of the lobby. Courtroom 4B sat on the 7th floor. Federal appointment hearing. Private access. Important people only. The entire courthouse had been buzzing about it since dawn. Rumor said a retiring judge was announcing something historic. Cole tilted his head with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Let me guess," he said. "You're somebody's assistant?" Naomi looked back at him calmly. "No, sir." "Intern?" "No, sir." He smiled wider now, enjoying the audience gathering around them. "Then I think we're done here." For a brief second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi's eyes moved past him toward the security gate. Toward the deputies pretending not to stare. Toward the cluster of reporters quietly raising phones. Then she nodded once, almost to herself. "All right," she said softly. "If that's how you'd like to handle this." Something about the way she said it caused the deputy nearest the scanner to shift uncomfortably. Cole didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. He straightened his uniform sleeves and pointed casually toward the rear hallway. "Maintenance access is downstairs next to the loading dock." Naomi stared at him for one long silent moment. Her expression never changed, but the stillness around her felt heavier now, sharper somehow, like the air before a thunderstorm cracks open over Georgia heat. Then the elevator at the far end of the lobby chimed softly. The brass doors slid apart. And every conversation in the courthouse suddenly stopped. The elevator doors opened with a soft metallic whisper, and the atmosphere inside the courthouse shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. A reporter near the security desk slowly lowered his phone. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now, reduced to a faint hiss against the tall windows overlooking Mitchell Street. Naomi Brooks did not turn around immediately. She stood motionless beneath the harsh lobby lights while polished dress shoes clicked across the marble floor behind her in slow, measured rhythm. Sheriff Cole Walker straightened at once, the smugness on his face tightening into something more formal. "Your Honor," he said quickly. Chief Judge Eleanor Whitmore stepped out of the elevator wearing a charcoal gray judicial robe that moved heavily around her shoulders. At nearly 70 years old, she carried herself with the kind of authority that silenced rooms without effort. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her ears, and a thin pair of reading glasses rested low against her nose as she scanned the lobby with cool precision. Two federal clerks followed several steps behind her carrying stacks of folders and leather portfolios. Judge Whitmore's eyes stopped on Naomi almost immediately. Not surprise. Recognition. That was what unsettled the room. Naomi finally turned then, calm as ever, one hand still wrapped around the worn leather folder against her chest. For a second, neither woman spoke. The courthouse seemed frozen in place around them. Somewhere near the entrance, a coffee machine hissed steam into the silence. Sheriff Walker cleared his throat quickly. "Apologies, Your Honor. We were just handling a little confusion at security." Judge Whitmore did not look at him. "Were you?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried cleanly across the marble lobby. Cole forced a smile that looked thinner now. "She claimed she was here for courtroom 4B. One of the younger deputies glanced away awkwardly. Another adjusted the radio clip to his shoulder, suddenly very interested in the floor. Judge Whitmore stepped forward slowly, her robe brushing softly against the polished stone. "And that surprised you?" she asked. Cole laughed once under his breath, uncertain now. "Well, ma'am, considering the nature of the hearing," he let the sentence trail off. He did not need to finish it. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, not out of shame, but patience. The same patience worn by people who had spent years learning when silence spoke louder than anger. Judge Whitmore finally turned toward the sheriff fully. "Sheriff Walker," she said, adjusting the papers in her hand, "how long have you worked in this courthouse?" "Almost 19 years, Your Honor." 19 years. She nodded faintly. "Then you should know better than to confuse appearance with qualification." The words landed harder than shouting ever could. Cole's jaw tightened immediately. Around them, attorneys shifted uncomfortably near the security checkpoint. Nobody laughed anymore. Naomi remained perfectly still beneath the fluorescent lights, but the pressure in the room had changed now. The balance had tilted, subtle but undeniable. Judge Whitmore looked back toward Naomi, and for the first time that morning, warmth touched her expression. "Good morning, Counselor Brooks." Several heads snapped toward Naomi at once. A reporter near the elevators blinked rapidly and grabbed his notepad. Sheriff Walker stared at Naomi as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Counselor. Not assistant. Not maintenance. Not lost." Naomi offered a small respectful nod. "Good morning, Your Honor." Her voice stayed calm, steady, untouched by everything that had happened minutes earlier. Judge Whitmore extended one hand toward the elevators. "They are waiting upstairs." Naomi stepped forward quietly, her flats clicking softly across the marble floor. As she passed Sheriff Walker, he instinctively moved aside without a word. The smell of rain drifted through the lobby doors again as another gust of wind rattled the glass outside. Cole watched Naomi enter the elevator beside the chief judge, the worn leather folder still tucked carefully beneath her arm. Then the brass doors closed between them with a low metallic thud, leaving the entire courthouse standing in stunned silence. The seventh floor felt different from the rest of the courthouse. Quieter. Colder somehow. The air carried the faint scent of old wood polish and fresh printer ink, untouched by the noise and chaos below. Naomi stepped out of the elevator beside Judge Whitmore into a long corridor lined with framed photographs of retired federal judges, nearly all white men staring down from gold-trimmed frames beneath soft recessed lighting. Her reflection moved faintly across the polished walnut walls as she walked. Two clerks hurried ahead carrying binders stacked nearly a foot high while courthouse staff whispered behind partially opened office doors. Word was already spreading. Naomi could feel it in the stares. Some curious. Some respectful. Others uncertain. Judge Whitmore walked with measured calm beside her, one hand resting lightly against a leather case tucked beneath her arm. "You handled yourself well." "Downstairs," she said quietly. Naomi exhaled once through her nose. "I have had practice." The judge glanced toward her briefly, understanding more than the words themselves. They continued toward courtroom 4B at the end of the hall, where a pair of large oak doors stood closed beneath the federal seal. Through the thick wood came the muffled sound of voices, chairs moving, camera shutters clicking softly. Press. Attorneys. State officials. Naomi slowed slightly as they approached. The brass handle of the leather folder in her hand pressed cool against her fingertips now. Inside were 20 years of work reduced to paper. Appellate decisions. Civil rights cases. Legal reviews. Hundreds of nights beneath fluorescent office lights while the rest of Atlanta slept. Judge Whitmore stopped just before the doors. "Nervous?" she asked. Naomi allowed herself the faintest smile. "A little." "Good," the judge replied softly. "People who are never nervous before power usually should not have it." For a moment neither woman moved. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a courthouse clock chimed 10 o'clock. The sound echoed softly against the high ceilings. Naomi looked toward the row of framed judges again. "My father used to clean this floor," she said quietly. Judge Whitmore turned toward her. Naomi's eyes stayed on the photographs. Every night for almost 22 years. He knew every office in this building better than most attorneys did. A faint warmth touched the older woman's face. "I remember Harold Brooks." Naomi blinked, surprised. "You do?" "He once found an envelope containing sealed evidence left behind after a hearing. Walked 3 blocks in the rain to return it personally instead of leaving it with security." The judge adjusted her glasses slightly. "Your father had integrity long before this courthouse started using that word in speeches." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. The memory hit harder than she expected. Her father in his gray maintenance uniform. The smell of lemon cleaner on his hands. Late nights waiting beside vending machines while he finished mopping empty courtrooms after midnight. He used to tell her the law was not marble columns or black robes. It was people. Good people willing to stand between fairness and power. A door opened farther down the hallway, interrupting the silence. 2 reporters emerged quickly, speaking in hushed, excited voices. One noticed Naomi immediately and slowed. Recognition flashed across his face. "That is her," he whispered. Another camera lifted subtly. Naomi ignored it. Judge Whitmore placed one steady hand against the courtroom doors. "Ready?" Naomi straightened slightly, shoulders calm beneath her navy coat. "Yes, Your Honor." The heavy oak doors opened inward at last. Light spilled across the corridor from inside the packed courtroom beyond. Rows of dark suits turned toward the entrance almost instantly. Conversations stopped. Camera flashes flickered once against the polished walls. And near the front row beside the deputy seating area, Sheriff Cole Walker slowly rose to his feet, the color draining from his face as Naomi Brooks entered the courtroom beside the chief judge of the federal district court. The courtroom lights felt brighter than usual, reflecting off polished wood and rows of dark leather chairs filled with attorneys, reporters, city officials, and federal staffers whispering behind folded hands. Naomi could feel every pair of eyes following her as she walked beside Judge Whitmore down the center aisle. The sound of her flats against the hardwood floor echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Calm. Measured. Unhurried. Near the front row, Sheriff Cole Walker remained standing beside the deputy section, one hand still resting against the back of a chair as if he had forgotten what to do next. The confidence that had filled his voice downstairs was gone now, replaced by something tighter around the eyes. Uncertainty. Judge Whitmore reached the front bench and placed her folder carefully beside the microphone. "Please be seated," she said. Chairs shifted throughout the courtroom in a wave of movement and fabric. Naomi moved toward the long counsel table near the bench while camera shutters clicked quietly from the press row. A young legal clerk rushed forward to pull out a chair for her. Naomi thanked him softly and sat down, placing the worn leather folder neatly in front of her. Across the room, two reporters leaned toward each other immediately. "That is Naomi Brooks," one whispered. "The appellate attorney from Chicago?" The other nodded quickly without looking away from her. "Won 3 constitutional cases before 40. Sheriff Walker heard every word. His jaw tightened hard enough to show beneath the courthouse lights. He glanced toward Naomi again, studying her now with visible confusion, as though trying to reconcile the woman he mocked downstairs with the calm attorney sitting 20 feet away beneath the federal seal. Judge Whitmore adjusted the microphone slightly. "Before today's proceedings begin," she said, "there is an announcement this court has waited a long time to make." The room fell completely silent. Rain continued sliding down the tall windows overlooking downtown Atlanta, turning the city skyline gray and blurred beyond the glass. Naomi folded her hands together loosely on the table. She could feel her heartbeat now, steady but heavier than before. Years of work had led to this room. Years of being underestimated before she ever opened her mouth. Judge Whitmore continued. "For nearly 3 decades, this district has searched for legal minds capable of protecting the integrity of federal law while understanding the communities most affected by it." Her eyes shifted toward Naomi briefly. "Today, I am proud to present someone who has done exactly that her entire career." A few heads turned fully toward Naomi now. Reporters lifted pens. One camera light blinked red near the back row. Sheriff Walker remained motionless beside the deputies, but his face had begun losing color beneath the fluorescent lights. Judge Whitmore opened a dark folder slowly. Graduate of Howard University School of Law. Former federal appellate specialist. Led counsel in multiple civil rights decisions reviewed by the 11th Circuit Court. The words rolled through the courtroom one by one, each landing heavier than the last. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, listening without expression. A woman whose legal work has protected voting access, housing rights, and constitutional protections for thousands of Americans across 3 states. A long pause followed. Then Judge Whitmore looked directly toward the audience. "Effective next month, Counselor Naomi Brooks will assume my seat as United States federal judge for the Northern District of Georgia." The room exploded into stunned silence before applause slowly began rising from different corners of the courtroom. Some people stood immediately. Others remained frozen in disbelief. Naomi inhaled carefully as the sound filled the chamber around her. But near the deputy section, Sheriff Cole Walker did not clap. He only stared at her across the courtroom with the look of a man suddenly realizing the floor beneath him was never as solid as he believed. The applause faded slowly, uneven at first, then swallowed by the heavy stillness settling back over the courtroom. Naomi remained seated at the counsel table, her hands folded calmly beside the leather folder while flashes from reporters' cameras flickered against the dark paneled walls. The federal seal above the bench seemed larger now somehow, looming over the room in gold and deep navy beneath recessed lights. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses carefully and looked across the courtroom with quiet satisfaction. "There will be a formal swearing-in ceremony next month," she announced. "Until then, Counselor Brooks will participate in transitional proceedings effective immediately." A low murmur spread through the audience again. Naomi could hear chairs shifting behind her, whispers bouncing softly beneath the high ceiling. Some voices carried admiration. Others sounded stunned. Near the back row, one older attorney shook his head slowly and whispered, "I did not even know she was being considered." Another answered under his breath, "That is because she does not spend time trying to impress rooms like this." Naomi heard that too. She heard everything. Years inside courtrooms had taught her how to listen without looking like she was listening at all. Across the chamber, Sheriff Cole Walker finally sat down heavily beside the deputy section. His expression had hardened again, but the arrogance was gone now, replaced by something more unsettled. His fingers tapped once against the polished armrest before stopping completely. A younger deputy leaned toward him quietly. "Sheriff," Cole cut him off immediately without taking his eyes off Naomi. "Do not." The deputy straightened at once. Judge Whitmore continued discussing procedural matters from the bench, but Sheriff Walker barely seemed to hear any of it. His attention remained fixed on Naomi as though replaying every word he had said downstairs. "Janitors use the back entrance. Maintenance access is downstairs." The memory sat visibly on his face now like heat under skin. Naomi opened her folder calmly, reviewing briefing papers with composed focus despite the pressure surrounding her. The pages smelled faintly of ink and old leather. Typed notes. Constitutional citations. Handwritten edits in blue pen running along the margins. Familiar things. Grounding things. Her father used to tell her paper mattered because paper remembered what people preferred to forget. The thought passed quietly through her mind as another camera shutter clicked nearby. Then suddenly the courtroom doors opened again. A court officer entered quickly holding a sealed envelope. "Urgent filing for preliminary review," he said softly, approaching the bench. Judge Whitmore accepted the envelope, scanned the first page briefly, then frowned. "This should have been filed yesterday." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "There appears to be a procedural conflict involving county evidence handling, Your Honor." The room stirred again. Several attorneys exchanged looks immediately. Judge Whitmore flipped another page, her expression tightening slightly. "Who processed this chain of custody?" she asked. Silence. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, eyes around the courtroom began drifting toward the deputy section. Toward Sheriff Walker. Cole straightened immediately. There must be some mistake. Judge Whitmore looked down at the document again. The filing alleges improper evidence storage in at least 4 pending cases. A wave of whispers swept through the gallery. Naomi remained still, but her eyes lifted carefully toward the bench. Judge Whitmore continued reading silently for another moment before removing her glasses again. "Sheriff Walker," she said evenly, "these allegations are serious." Cole stood abruptly now, tension visible across his shoulders. "Your Honor, my department follows every required procedure." But his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier that morning. Naomi noticed it instantly. Everyone did. Judge Whitmore glanced toward Naomi then, only briefly, but enough. "Counselor Brooks," she said calmly, "since you are now joining this court during transition, I would value your legal assessment before we proceed." The courtroom fell silent again. Sheriff Walker turned toward Naomi sharply, disbelief flashing across his face. Just hours earlier he had tried to force her toward a loading dock downstairs. Now the entire federal courtroom waited for her opinion. Naomi closed the folder slowly in front of her and rose to her feet beneath the cold white lights while rain continued sliding quietly down the courthouse windows behind her. Naomi stood slowly from the counsel table, smoothing one hand against the front of her navy coat while the courtroom watched in complete silence. Outside the tall windows, rain rolled down the glass in long silver streaks, blurring the Atlanta skyline into soft gray shadows. The overhead lights hummed quietly above rows of dark wooden benches packed with attorneys, reporters, deputies, and city officials who suddenly seemed afraid to move too quickly. Sheriff Cole Walker remained standing near the deputy section, shoulders tense beneath his tan uniform, one hand resting against the edge of the table beside him. Naomi could feel his eyes on her before she even looked in his direction. Judge Whitmore handed down the sealed filing toward the clerk. "Counselor Brooks," she said calmly, "please review the procedural concerns regarding evidence handling." Naomi stepped forward without hurry and accepted the documents carefully. The paper felt cool against her fingertips. Fresh ink. Recently filed. She scanned the first page in silence while the room waited. The only sound came from rain tapping softly against the courthouse windows and the distant rumble of thunder somewhere beyond downtown. Naomi turned one page. Then another. Her expression remained unreadable, but the pace of her eyes slowed slightly near the middle section. Sheriff Walker noticed immediately. "Your Honor," he interrupted, forcing steadiness into his voice, "with respect, those accusations are incomplete." Naomi looked up at him for the first time since standing. Calm. Direct. Not angry. Somehow that made the pressure worse. Judge Whitmore folded her hands together on the bench. "You will have an opportunity to respond, Sheriff." Cole nodded stiffly, though tension remained visible along his jaw. Naomi continued reading quietly. The filing referenced missing timestamps, unsigned transfer logs, improperly sealed evidence containers. Small procedural failures on paper. Dangerous ones inside a courtroom. She understood that instantly. Every attorney in the room did too. A mistrial did not begin with drama. It began with details people ignored until it was too late. Naomi lowered the papers slowly. "The chain of custody documentation appears inconsistent across multiple submissions," she said at last. Her voice stayed level, precise, carrying cleanly through the silent courtroom. Specifically regarding intake verification and secondary storage authorization. Several reporters began scribbling quickly. Sheriff Walker shifted his weight. "Those records are handled by multiple departments." Naomi nodded once. "I understand. No accusation. No hostility. Just facts." Judge Whitmore watched her carefully from the bench, almost proud. Naomi continued. "At this stage, the concern is not intent. It is procedural reliability." Sheriff Walker exhaled sharply through his nose. "My department does not mishandle evidence." Naomi turned one final page before closing the folder gently. "Then a formal review should protect your department as much as the court." The words landed softly, but they changed the room immediately. A few attorneys exchanged glances. One older federal prosecutor gave a faint approving nod. Naomi had not embarrassed him. Had not attacked him publicly. She had offered him fairness even after everything downstairs. Sheriff Walker seemed to realize that a second later. The tension in his face faltered. Slightly, replaced by something more human now. Not pride. Not anger. Shame. Judge Whitmore leaned back slowly in her chair. "I agree." She looked toward the clerk. "Initiate procedural review pending further examination." The clerk nodded quickly and began writing. Naomi returned the filing neatly to the bench before stepping back toward the counsel table. As she passed the deputy section, Sheriff Walker lowered his eyes for the first time that morning. Naomi noticed it, but she kept walking. No triumph crossed her face. No satisfaction. Just quiet composure beneath the cold courthouse lights. She sat down slowly, folding her hands once more atop the worn leather folder that had traveled with her through every courtroom of her career. Rain continued falling outside while the federal seal above the bench gleamed softly in gold behind her. And in the heavy silence filling courtroom 4B, the balance of power had shifted so completely that everyone in the room could feel it. The hearing recessed 20 minutes later, but nobody rushed to leave courtroom 4B. The atmosphere had changed too much for casual conversation now. Reporters clustered quietly near the back rows, whispering over legal pads and glowing phone screens while courthouse staff moved through the aisles carrying folders and half-empty coffee cups. Outside, the storm had weakened into a steady drizzle, leaving long streams of rainwater crawling down the tall windows beside the jury box. Naomi remained seated alone at the counsel table after most of the room had emptied, reviewing procedural notes beneath the soft hum of overhead lights. The leather folder rested open before her, pages neatly aligned, blue ink annotations running carefully along the margins. Across the courtroom, Sheriff Cole Walker stood near the deputy entrance staring at her from a distance he suddenly seemed unsure how to cross. One by one, the remaining deputies slipped quietly into the hallway, leaving him behind in the strange silence hanging over the chamber. Naomi sensed him approach before she looked up. His boots moved slower now against the hardwood floor. No swagger. No performance. Just the heavy sound of a man carrying something he could no longer ignore. He stopped a few feet from the counsel table and cleared his throat softly. Naomi closed the folder without hurry and lifted her eyes toward him. Up close, he looked older than he had downstairs that morning. The sharp confidence around his expression had faded, replaced by exhaustion sitting heavily beneath pale blue eyes. For a second he said nothing at all. The silence stretched long enough for rain tapping against the courthouse windows to become the loudest sound in the room. Finally he spoke. "I did not know who you were." Naomi held his gaze calmly. "I know." He swallowed once. That is not an excuse. Those words seemed difficult for him to say. Naomi noticed that too. Sheriff Walker glanced down briefly at his own hands before speaking again. "Truth is," he stopped, jaw tightening slightly. "I made assumptions the second I saw you standing in that lobby." No denial. No attempt to soften it. Just honesty stripped bare beneath fluorescent lights and empty courtroom benches. Naomi remained still. "Yes," she said quietly. Cole nodded once, ashamed now in a way pride could no longer hide. "And the worst part is," he exhaled slowly through his nose, "I did not even realize I was doing it anymore." The confession hung heavily between them. Naomi looked toward the rain streaking down the courthouse windows before answering. "That is usually how it works." Cole's eyes lowered again. Somewhere outside the courtroom, a copy machine beeped faintly down the hallway. Footsteps passed in the distance and faded away. Inside courtroom 4B, everything else remained still. "My father was a deputy sheriff," Cole said suddenly. Naomi looked back at him. "Small town outside Macon. He used to tell me authority depended on reading people fast." He gave a bitter half-laugh without humor. "Turns out I spent years thinking I could tell who mattered just by looking at them." Naomi studied him quietly for a moment. The anger she could have carried into this room never appeared on her face. Only calm. Measured calm shaped by years of surviving rooms exactly like this one. "My father cleaned courtrooms at night," she said softly. Cole blinked once. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the empty judge's bench at the front of the chamber. Most people never learned his name either. The words landed harder than accusation ever could. Sheriff Walker looked away immediately, shame washing visibly across his face now. For several long seconds neither spoke. Then slowly, Cole removed the sheriff's badge clipped to his belt and turned it over once in his hands beneath the pale courthouse lights. "I spent 19 years wearing this thing," he said quietly. "Today was the first time I understood how dangerous power becomes when respect is conditional." Naomi stood then, gathering the leather folder calmly against her chest. Cole stepped aside automatically, making room for her path without thinking. Before she passed him, Naomi paused briefly beside the counsel table. "Respect is not supposed to be earned by titles," she said. "That is what the law is for. To remind people of that when they forget." Then she walked quietly toward the front bench while Sheriff Cole Walker remained standing alone beneath the federal seal, holding his badge in silence as rain continued falling softly beyond the courthouse windows. By late afternoon, the courthouse had emptied into a quieter kind of exhaustion. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving the sidewalks of downtown Atlanta slick beneath pale sunlight breaking through scattered clouds. Water dripped steadily from the courthouse steps while reporters packed away cameras beside idling news vans parked along the curb. Inside courtroom 4B, the overhead lights had dimmed slightly, casting long amber reflections across polished wood and empty benches. Naomi stood near the front row gathering the last of her files into the worn leather folder her father once carried lunch in during overnight cleaning shifts years earlier. The room smelled faintly of rainwater, paper, and cooling coffee forgotten beside the clerk's station. Behind her, the heavy courtroom doors opened slowly again. Sheriff Cole Walker stepped inside alone. No deputies. No audience. Just the soft sound of boots against hardwood floors and the quiet creak of old hinges closing behind him. Naomi did not turn immediately. She slid one final document into the folder with careful precision before resting both hands lightly against the table edge. Cole stopped several feet away, uncertain now in a room where he once felt untouchable. Sunlight from the tall windows stretched across half his uniform, leaving the other half in shadow. "Counselor Brooks," he said quietly. Naomi looked over her shoulder. "It is Judge now, I suppose." There was no sarcasm in her voice. Only calm truth. Cole nodded once. Judge Brooks. The title sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, but sincere. He glanced toward the empty benches surrounding them before speaking again. "I spent most of today thinking about something." Naomi waited silently. Cole exhaled slowly. "You never tried to humiliate me back." Naomi closed the folder gently. That would not have fixed anything. The honesty of the answer seemed to hit him harder than anger would have. He lowered his eyes briefly toward the polished courtroom floor. "I deserved it." Naomi studied him quietly for a moment. Through the tall windows behind them, sunlight caught suspended dust drifting through the air like tiny particles of gold. Somewhere far below, a car horn echoed faintly through the city streets before fading away again. "Maybe," she said softly. "But humiliation teaches people how to hide. Not how to change." Cole looked at her then, fully this time. Whatever remained of his pride seemed smaller now. "Human. I have a daughter," he admitted suddenly. Naomi's expression shifted slightly. "She is 16. Smart as hell. Wants to study criminal law someday." His jaw tightened faintly before he continued. "Today I kept thinking, if somebody spoke to her the way I spoke to you downstairs." He stopped there. He did not finish the sentence because he did not need to. Naomi understood anyway. The silence between them no longer felt hostile now. Just heavy with things finally being seen clearly. Cole reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded courthouse visitor badge. Naomi recognized it immediately. The temporary pass he had handed her that morning with quiet mockery still attached to it. He looked down at the crumpled paper for a second, before setting it carefully on the counsel table between them. "I cannot take back what I said." His voice stayed low. "But I can remember this moment every time I put on that badge again." Naomi glanced down at the folded visitor pass beneath the fading afternoon light. Then she looked back at him calmly. "People rarely reveal their character when things are comfortable, Sheriff." Cole swallowed once. Naomi continued softly. "They reveal it when they believe nobody important is watching." The words settled deeply into the quiet courtroom. Cole nodded slowly, accepting them without defense. Somewhere above the bench, the old courthouse clock ticked softly through the stillness. Naomi lifted the leather folder against her chest and stepped toward the aisle leading to the courtroom doors. As she passed him, Cole moved aside immediately. Not because of status now. Respect. Real respect. Naomi paused briefly near the doorway before speaking one final time without turning around. "Make sure your daughter never has to wonder whether she belongs in a room before she even speaks." Then she walked into the fading golden light of the courthouse corridor while Sheriff Cole Walker remained standing alone beside the empty benches, staring quietly at the folded visitor badge resting on the polished wood table. 1 month later, sunlight poured across the front steps of the Fulton County Federal Courthouse beneath a clear Georgia sky washed clean after days of spring rain. Black government sedans lined the curb while reporters gathered behind barricades near the entrance, their cameras glinting beneath the late morning light. People moved through the plaza in pressed suits and polished shoes, carrying folders, coffee cups, and courthouse badges swinging gently against their jackets. But inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere felt strangely still. Quiet in the way churches felt quiet before prayer. Naomi stood alone near the rear hallway outside the judge's chambers, one hand resting against the worn leather folder she had carried for nearly 15 years. The navy judicial robe hanging over her shoulders felt heavier than she expected. Not uncomfortable. Just real. Through the partially opened courtroom doors came the soft murmur of guests finding seats and the faint scrape of wooden benches shifting across old floors. Naomi closed her eyes briefly and inhaled. Lemon polish. Paper. Coffee. Rain lingering somewhere deep in the building's old stone walls. The same courthouse smell she remembered from childhood nights waiting for her father to finish cleaning empty courtrooms long after midnight. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Judge Whitmore stepped quietly into the hallway, no longer wearing formal robes today. Retirement seemed to have softened something around her eyes. "They are ready for you," she said gently. Naomi nodded once. Neither woman moved immediately. Sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the hallway floor between them in long golden rectangles. "Your father would have been proud today," Judge Whitmore said softly. Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, emotion finally touching the calm she had carried so carefully for weeks. "Thank you." The older woman smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "Thank you for reminding this courthouse what dignity looks like." Then she stepped aside toward the courtroom doors. Naomi entered slowly. The room rose to its feet almost instantly. Attorneys. Clerks. Reporters. Federal officials. Deputies. The sound of chairs moving echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling as sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows behind the bench, bathing the room in warm amber light. Naomi walked down the center aisle with calm measured steps, the black robe brushing softly against polished hardwood floors. At the front row near the deputy section stood Sheriff Cole Walker beside a teenage girl with dark blonde hair pulled into a neat braid. His daughter. The moment Naomi passed them, the girl looked at her with open admiration impossible to fake. Cole met Naomi's eyes briefly and gave a small respectful nod. No pride. No performance. Just quiet understanding. Naomi returned the nod gently before continuing forward. At the bench, the courtroom clerk administered the oath beneath the federal seal while sunlight illuminated drifting dust particles high above the chamber like suspended gold. Naomi repeated every word clearly, her voice steady through the silence. When it was finished, applause filled the courtroom warmly this time. Not shocked applause. Proud applause. Naomi turned toward the bench slowly. The polished wood gleamed beneath the overhead lights, dark and worn from decades of hands, rulings, and history. For one still moment she simply looked at it. Then carefully, almost reverently, she took her seat. The courtroom settled gradually into silence around her. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the edge of the bench, fingertips tracing the smooth wood grain her father once cleaned night after night while nobody noticed him passing through empty rooms with a mop bucket and a ring of courthouse keys. Outside the tall windows, sunlight flooded downtown Atlanta in soft gold. Inside courtroom 4B, nobody spoke. The federal seal hung motionless above her while the quiet hum of the courthouse carried faintly through distant hallways beyond the chamber doors. Naomi sat calmly beneath the light, shoulders steady, eyes forward, the weight of history resting gently around her at last. And in the silence filling the courtroom, justice no longer looked distant. It looked human.